Remember this little guy? If you had primary school music education, there's a non-trivial chance that you learned to play the recorder. Not everywhere, of course, but in many places the recorder became the default instrument for beginner music classes. But why the recorder? Why not the violin, the clarinet, or any number of other instruments? According to Esperantist Tim Morley in his 2012 TEDx talk, it's quite simply because the recorder is easy for kids to play. It's small, the finger patterns are pretty easy to figure out, and if you just don't blow too hard in it, you should be able to produce your first notes pretty fast. Compare that to a bassoon. The bassoon is much larger. It can be difficult to reach the keys. The finger patterns are harder to figure out, and the double reed makes it notoriously difficult to produce your first notes on it. If a child starts learning music directly on the bassoon, they might find it too difficult. So much so that they might get discouraged and give up on music entirely. But if you start with a recorder, then it's much easier. The child can comfortably learn the basics of music, like time signatures, major and minor scales and whatnot, without having to struggle with all the things that makes the bassoon hard to play. And once they're ready, they can switch over to the bassoon, and the knowledge they've gained from the recorder will transfer over. Or so Morley argues. But Morley's interest doesn't actually lie in music. He's a language teacher. When he talks about recorders and bassoons, it's just as an analogy for languages. The bassoon is a natural language, like French, Spanish, Mandarin, and so on. And the recorder is Esperanto, a constructed language that was designed to be simple and easy to learn. What Morley is arguing is that children should learn Esperanto as a kind of starter language that'll then make it easier for them to learn other, harder languages. This idea that learning Esperanto can facilitate the learning of other languages has been around for quite a while, almost since the inception of the language in the late 19th century. In the Esperantist literature, it's sometimes referred to as the propaedeutic value of Esperanto, which is just a fancy way of saying Esperanto as a starter language, an introductory course, as it were. The basic idea is this. You take two groups of students, Group A and Group B. Let's say they're all English native speakers and you want to teach them Spanish. Group A studies Spanish for 4 years. Group B studies Esperanto for 1 year, and then Spanish for 3. The contention is that by the end of those 4 years, Group B, the one that studied Esperanto, will actually outperform Group A in Spanish, even if they've been learning it for less time. The time frames aren't always the same, but that's the basic idea. If you start with Esperanto, you'll eventually catch up with and surpass the students who started out with the harder natural language, even if they've been studying it for longer than you. I found the idea intriguing because it sits at the confluence of two conflicting intuitions. On the one hand, the idea that you should start simple and gradually increase the difficulty, that makes perfect sense to me. So if Esperanto is really much easier than natural languages, then sure, why not start with Esperanto? But on the other hand, you get good at what you practice. So it would make more sense to start directly with whatever language you want to learn, instead of using Esperanto as a stepping stone. After all, even if some of the knowledge you've gained by studying Esperanto does transfer over, some of it won't, and the time you spent learning that knowledge is wasted. So if we're just looking at a priori arguments, both sides kind of make sense to me. But what does the evidence say? Considering just how niche a topic this is, there's a decent amount of experiments on it, dating back to as early as the 1920s. I reviewed as many as I could get my hands on. The first thing that stands out is just how many problems there are in this area of research. Anecdotal reporting, omission of important data like sample or effect sizes, lack of experimental design, and so on. By the time I sifted through it all, I was left with only 4 studies that met my own standards. The rest I discarded. It's debatable whether that was the right thing to do or not. Someone else might look at one of the studies I discarded and say, well, okay, it's got a bunch of flaws, so we shouldn't take any of this as conclusive evidence, but nonetheless, it's probably still worth mentioning because their findings do point in a certain direction. And that's fair enough, but it's just not how my own mind works. So just to give you a sense of what I discarded and why, let me walk you through a few examples. The earliest experiment I could find was a 3-year experiment from 1918 to 1921 run in the girls' secondary school at Bishop Auckland in the UK. In 1922, Alexandra Fisher, the principal of the school, published a paper on the experiment in the journal Modern Languages. Here's the setup. In the first year, there were two groups of students. Group A studied Esperanto, Group B studied French. In the second year, Group A quit Esperanto and started studying either French or German. Group B continued to study French. Next to that, there was a third group, Group C, which was comprised only of new students who joined the school directly in the second year, so they hadn't studied any language in year one. But in year two, Group C studied either French or German. In the third year, all of these students were reshuffled into three different classes based on their academic performance. Class 1 was the highest scoring students, Class 2 was the mid-range, and Class 3 was comprised of the lowest scoring students. Here's what they found. Class 3 was mostly made up of the students from Group C, which I suppose makes sense, since these are students that arrived in the second year. They'd been studying language for a year less than everyone else. Class 2 was mostly made up of the students from Group B, so the students who had studied French since year 1. And Class 1, the top class, was mostly made up of the students from Group A, the ones who had learned Esperanto in their first year. Fisher takes this as evidence that it is beneficial to study Esperanto as a starter language. So why did I discard this one? Well, while we do get some interesting qualitative information about what activities they did in class, what textbooks they used, how students felt about their classes and whatnot, in terms of quantitative information, there's just not much to go on. We're not told how many students were in each group, how their performances were assessed, how significant the differences were between each group, and so on. The absence of any raw data is already a problem on its own, but here it's even worse because, as it turns out, we get different sources saying different things. Fisher writes that among the students who had studied Esperanto, those who went on to study German, quote, gained much less from it than those who went on to study French. Since she uses the word gain, the implication is that they were still better off than the students who hadn't studied Esperanto. However, as Fisher also tells us, the experiment was sanctioned by the British Board of Education, and they expected careful records to be kept. I don't know what exactly was in those records, but in 1922, that same Board of Education wrote about the experiment in a memorandum to a report to the League of Nations. They have this to say, quote, Esperanto was introduced experimentally into the girls' secondary school at Bishop Auckland, and an attempt was made to assess its value as a preparation for French and German. The results were inconclusive. The girls who had learned Esperanto made more rapid progress in French than those who had learned no foreign language, but the reverse happened in the case of German. This may have been due to the greater resemblance of Esperanto to French than to German, or it may have been due to differences of ability among the girls. So, Fisher is saying that Esperanto students did better in German than the non-Esperanto students, but the Board of Education is saying that it was the other way around. Since we don't have the raw data, there's really no way of telling who's right. Beyond that, they just didn't control for a bunch of different variables. This is where the whole thing basically falls apart for me. Fisher writes, quote, any absolute estimate of the value of the teaching of Esperanto is rendered difficult by the fact that it was expedient to try such an experiment only with pupils who entered the school below the normal age for commencing a secondary school course. Consequently, the children who learned Esperanto were above the average in educability, having one admission in competitive examinations with their seniors, very slight allowance being made for age. In other words, the kids who studied Esperanto were all quote-unquote good students. Whether it's due to the environment or biology, they were all the kind of student who can skip a grade or two. Is it really all that surprising that they got the best results? For me, if you don't control for that kind of variable, then you really can't conclude anything from the experiment, other than perhaps just a tautological, students who do well in school, do well in school. So that's the kind of thing I ended up discarding. In other cases, they do seem to have controlled for other variables, but the reporting is so short that you basically just have to trust the authors. For example, in 1934, Helen Eaton published an account of some similar experiments. We get some quantitative information on the scores achieved, and we're told how they were assessed, so it's a bit more workable than Fisher's paper. We're also told that they tried to control for variables like IQ and linguistic background. But we're not told how they controlled for those variables, and overall, so much data is omitted, even obvious things like how many students participated in the experiment, that personally I'm just not comfortable taking their work at face value. Once I sifted through everything, I was left with 4 studies. The first is a 1952 paper by J. H. Halloran of the University of Sheffield in the UK. The experiment he describes ran from 1947 to 1952 in a provincial grammar school. Some students studied Esperanto for 1 year, then French for 3, and the other students studied French for 4 years. He provides most of the quantitative information we need, and he controls for variables like intelligence or aptitude, the influence of the teaching environment, and so on. He also takes it a step further and assesses students on different aspects of the language they learned, like reading comprehension, oral comprehension, lexical knowledge, and so on. And that allows him to fine-tune his observations of the kind of effect learning Esperanto might have. His first notable observation is that the difference between the Esperanto students and the non-Esperanto students just isn't all that great. As he says, quote, "It would appear from this comparison that, as a first step in the learning of French, Esperanto is neither a help nor a hindrance." Another interesting finding is when Halloran breaks down student performance into active and passive types of knowledge. On passive knowledge of French, things like reading and oral comprehension and whatnot, the Esperanto students scored better than the non-Esperanto students. But on active knowledge, things like writing and speaking, it was the other way around. But perhaps his most important finding is that the effect of learning Esperanto varied depending on the student. Among students who scored low on intelligence and verbal bias, those who studied Esperanto performed better than those who hadn't studied Esperanto. But among students who scored high on intelligence and verbal bias, it was the other way around, as if learning Esperanto had held them back, and they would have been better off starting straight with French. This was the first indication of what future studies would later confirm, namely that learning Esperanto as a starter language seems to have a kind of leveling effect. The worst students do better, but the best do worse. At the level of an entire class, then, there's less individual variation between students, and the results are more homogeneous than in classes that don't start with Esperanto. This leveling effect was also found in a series of 3 experiments run by Angela Tellier and Karen Rohr-Bracken from the University of Essex between 2013 and 2017. Tellier and Rohr-Bracken's 3 studies really stand out compared to the other experiments I reviewed. It's good science, with all the right design, controls, and caveats, basically everything you'd expect when reading a modern research paper. Their hypothesis is a bit more specific than just Esperanto is a good starter language. In a previous video, we mentioned the difference between implicit and explicit learning, or implicit and explicit knowledge. Implicit learning is the kind of subconscious learning associated with how young children learn their native language. Explicit learning, on the other hand, relies on conscious knowledge, like learning grammar rules and whatnot. Here's the thing. If you rely on implicit learning, it takes a ton of exposure to learn a language that way. In a high school system like the one in the UK, where you might have just 1 or 2 hours of foreign language class per week, you're just not going to get the amount of exposure you need for implicit learning to happen. With those time constraints, you'd get better results by relying on explicit learning. Here's where Esperanto comes into play. Because its grammar is so simple, Tellier and Rohr-Bracken posit that learning Esperanto might be a good way to jumpstart what they call metalinguistic awareness, which in turn would be involved in explicit learning. They define metalinguistic awareness as, quote, the ability to focus on and manipulate language form, to treat language as an object of inspection and analysis, and to make comparisons between languages. So it's not exactly the same thing as explicit learning, but it's part of a nexus of overlapping concepts that all point towards the same thing. So, their three experiments together were designed to investigate whether or not learning Esperanto increased metalinguistic awareness more than other languages, and in turn, whether this led to better outcomes in language learning. Their conclusion is rather sobering. Quote, there is currently no evidence supporting the argument that Esperanto is a better tool than other European L2s in the foreign language classroom in England. They found that Esperanto had a leveling effect, and that's interesting in its own right, but that's about it. Esperanto didn't present any other benefits, neither in terms of metalinguistic awareness or in terms of proficiency in other foreign languages. So, is that it? Can we safely conclude from these experiments that Esperanto doesn't facilitate the learning of foreign languages, at least not any more than any other languages? Maybe, but best not count our chickens before they hatch. Altogether, with Halloran, Tilley, and Rohr-Bracken's work, what we have is a grand total of 4 studies that hold their own. That's not much, so you could reasonably argue that we need more studies before coming to any definitive conclusion. That, and all 4 experiments focus on similar age groups and similar educational settings. So you could argue that we need other experiments on different demographics and different educational settings. That said, it's probably wise for Esperanto speakers to be a bit cautious with claims about the propaedeutic effects of Esperanto. This isn't just some minor claim only a handful of Esperantists make. Many of the larger Esperanto organizations out there repeat the claim, sometimes as if it were fact. For example, in 1996, the World Esperanto Congress drafted the Prague Manifesto, a set of 7 principles that the Esperanto movement widely shares. This is an important document for the Esperanto community, and in it, they mention the supposed propaedeutic effects of Esperanto. To me, it seems a bit misguided to put that idea front and center when it just doesn't have much empirical backing. It might be an uncomfortable situation to be in, but for Esperantists who still defend the idea, I think it's probably best if they don't oversell it and are crystal clear about the current state of research. Tim Morley is exemplary in this regard. He very much supports the idea of teaching Esperanto as a starter language, and in fact he was involved in one of the experiments I discarded. But to his credit, he doesn't oversell it. At the 2017 Polyglot Gathering, Morley said, quote, it seems intuitively sensible, but in terms of scientific proof, anyone that tells you that it's scientifically proven that Esperanto has this effect is either lying or deluded, or possibly both. There's no scientific proof at all. And further, quote, it's a reasonable hypothesis, it seems to make sense, and personal experience suggests that there's something to it, but with my scientific hat on, I've got to say that the plural of anecdote is not data. As for me, while researching this, I kept wondering why Esperantist organizations were so adamant about this. Why are they pushing so hard for this idea that Esperanto is a good stepping stone to other languages? I know it's not what they mean by it, but to me it almost sounds kind of demeaning. It's as if they were saying, there aren't any good reasons to learn Esperanto for its own sake, so you should learn it because it helps to learn other languages which are worth learning. Obviously that's not what they mean, but to me that's how it comes off sometimes. While I'm sure they earnestly believe Esperanto has these propaedeutic qualities, I suspect the reason they're so insistent on it has more to do with practical considerations. Something like this. I want as many people as possible to learn Esperanto, and one way to do that is to ensure that Esperanto is taught in schools. Except here's the thing, society as a whole is pretty skeptical about Esperanto, and in some cases, is downright hostile. How can I get through to people in that context? Well, perhaps by presenting Esperanto as a starter language. You don't have to believe in the broader political project associated with Esperanto. You can even keep on believing some of the more prejudiced ideas about Esperanto. Things like, say, there's no point in learning Esperanto because it has no real culture, no real literature, and so on. But if I can just convince you that learning Esperanto is useful for learning other languages, then maybe I've got a shot at winning you over. From a practical perspective, it would make sense to approach things that way. If Esperanto is taught as a starter language in schools, then a lot more people would be exposed to the language than today. But at what cost? The idea that this might backfire kept nagging at me. Let's go back to the recorder for a second. Why did the recorder become the go-to instrument for primary schools? In their 1962 textbook, The School Recorder Book, Edmund Priestley and Fred Fowler writes, quote, "The recorder has been accepted as a most suitable instrument for music making in schools. It is inexpensive, it is a serious musical instrument with its own repertoire, it combines well with voices and other musical instruments, it is fairly easy to play, and a whole class can learn to play it at the same time." It's perhaps telling that inexpensive is the first thing they mentioned, and easy to play is pretty far down the list. If we retrace the history of how the recorder came to occupy such a role in schools, there are quite a few interesting things there. In the late 1800s, early 1900s, the recorder's golden age was long past, and it had been sidelined from mainstream Western music. But antiquarians and the like started to push for performances of early music. They wanted to hear old music played on the instruments it was intended to be played on. With notable figures like Arnold Dolmetsch in the UK or Willibald Gerlit in Germany, new recorders were made for these historical performances. These were instruments made by singular artisans. They were therefore quite expensive. But entrepreneurs like the German Peter Harlan saw an opportunity for mass production. Harlan wanted to create a Volks recorder in the same way that Hitler was pushing for a Volkswagen. In a time of high inflation and unemployment, a cheap people's recorder, just like a cheap people's car, was appealing. And Harlan managed to drive down cost. The introduction of plastic injection molding would further drive down cost, leading up to the kind of factory-made recorders we have today. A big chunk of the recorder's success in schools is that it was so cheap. Even today, a cheap plastic recorder is what, maybe $5-10 at most? Whereas a bassoon can easily cost you upwards of $1.5K. As I see it, the price tag was probably a bigger factor in why primary schools adopted the recorder, much more so than its supposed simplicity. But more importantly, one of the things we find when we look at the history of the recorder is that this idea that it's easy to play, this isn't some neutral, objective idea that just naturally occurs to anyone who plays the instrument. There's a pretty thick cultural overlay to it all. The late 19th and early 20th century saw the rise of the German youth movement. The German youth movement was originally a reaction to industrialization and the kind of authoritarian social structures that accompanied it. Shunning all of that, they turned to older cultural traditions, nature, and whatnot as an alternative. They disliked the complexity of modern compositions and favored simpler music. And for whatever reason, they started associating the recorder with their ideals. But the historical music being played by Dolmetsch and the like was by no means simple. As far as I can tell, the supposed simplicity of the recorder was less about how the recorder was actually played in earlier traditions, and more about how the German youth movement took that past and reimagined it, reshaping it into an idyllic version of the past that fit with their own ideals, but never actually existed. It may very well be true that compared to other instruments, the recorder is easier to pick up for complete beginners. But whatever difference in objective difficulty is actually there is probably quite small. It's the added cultural narrative that magnified those differences in difficulty and blew them out of proportion. It's a bit like the guitar today. If you listen to the works of Tárrega, the Bulerías of Paco de Lucía, or the Choros of Yamandu Costa, easy isn't the word that comes to mind. But if you just want to play open chords to accompany simple songs around the campfire or during a hike, then sure, that's easy enough. That's essentially what was happening with the recorder. To put it another way, it's easy not because the instrument itself is inherently easy. It's easy because, well, what we decided to do with it is easy. Some educators, like Karl Orff and Gunhild Kietmann, started using the recorder for beginner music classes. They used it in the same simplistic way the German youth movement was using it. Over time, the German youth movement was overtaken by nationalistic ideals. By the time the Nazis came to power, the recorder had been relegated to something only children and women should play, further solidifying this notion that the recorder was something easy and simple. It's used by a children's orchestra in the 1936 Olympic ceremony, widely disseminated this idea of the recorder as an instrument for children. Orphan Keatman, who had composed the music for that part of the Olympic ceremony, would later go on to publish other compositions and method books for children, further disseminating the recorder as a starter instrument for children. By focusing on its supposed simplicity, they managed to make the recorder a very popular starter instrument in schools, but it came at a cost. In the minds of many, the instrument is now indelibly associated with bad, out-of-tune renditions of the boring melodies they were forced to play in school. Even if it's a fully fledged instrument in its own right, with its own repertoire and a wide variety of players using it in many different genres, in most people's minds, the recorder is just that god-awful instrument they sucked at in primary school. Imposing the recorder as a stepping stone towards other instruments made it increasingly difficult to appreciate the recorder as an instrument in its own right. I've wondered if efforts to promote Esperanto as a starter language might backfire in the same way. There are plenty of good reasons to learn Esperanto, but promoting it as a stepping stone to other languages because it's easier to learn, that seems a bit risky. Let's just imagine for a second that the evidence strongly supported Esperanto as a starter language. It's now an incontrovertible fact that you should first learn Esperanto before any other foreign language. Congratulations! Esperanto is now the recorder of languages. Everyone's forced to learn it, everybody hates it, and the few that pursue mastery of the language for its own sake are now faced with a constant barrage of prejudice and ridicule. Hardly a desirable outcome. It might be meager consolation for those Esperantists who were hoping this would be their way in, their foot in the door so that Esperanto would finally get the recognition they feel it deserves. But I guess what I'm saying is, while I can very much sympathize with them, sometimes not getting what you want just might be a blessing in disguise.